Oh, hello, everyone. As Kat mentioned, my name is Rachel Groper, and I'm a very proud co-president of the Montreal Holocaust Museum. Thank you for joining us today on World Refugee Day. As a Holocaust survivor and former refugee myself, today is particularly significant for me. I'm very moved to welcome you to a program that reminds me and us of the enduring power of friendship, memory, and moral witnessing. Our museum's mission is to educate our public about the history of the Holocaust, and by doing so, to promote respect for diversity and the sanctity of human life. The brutal consequences of failing to protect the rights of refugees is ingrained in our museum's DNA, and I'm positive in mine as well. Canada's closed door immigration policies for Jews during the Holocaust have had a profound impact on our understanding of refugee rights. Many of you may know that none is too many, which is a quote from our wartime prime minister, is the Canadian writer Irving Abella's documentation of that era in our country. That is why our museum organizes events like these exhibitions, as well as providing free teaching tools to educate new generations about the rights and resiliency of those stateless and homeless who enter our borders. Today's event, as you know, is about the wonderful book called Homelands. I have to comment on it, so Chitra, forgive me. I may have misunderstood some of it. In Homelands, the history of friendship, the meaning of friendship, goes far beyond companionship. Chitra Ramaswamy portrays friendship as an act of remembrance, resistance, and healing. At the heart of the book is her relationship with Henry Wuga, a German refugee. It could as well be my name there, but I'd be a Polish refugee. Their connection across generation, faiths, and backgrounds is built on listening, trust, and shared humanity. Those three words ring hollow sometimes today when you turn on the news, but their bond shows that friendship, a very, very critically important part of my own life, can preserve memory. The two of them do that. They can bridge differences between religion, between citizenship, between age. They can counter forgetting in a world where truth isn't truth. It's called truthiness, and one wonders what's real and what isn't. And they have a commitment to remembering together. And friendship offers healing. For Chitra and Henry, it's an experience of understanding what displacement is about. Ultimately, for me, and in this book, which is why I relate to it so strongly, it's a sacred right, and it's an ethical act and a choice to show up, bear witness, and honor each other's humanity. We are really delighted and honored to have Chitra Ramaswamy with us and in conversation with Amy Williams. Chitra is an author and a journalist. Her latest book, Homelands, The History of a Friendship, won the Saltier Nonfiction Book of the Year award and was included in The Guardian's top memoirs of 2022. Her first book, Expecting the Inner Life of Pregnancy, won the Saltier First Book of the Year award, was shortlisted for the Polari Prize and reissued in the spring of 2024. She writes for The Guardian, I read it regularly, is the restaurant critic for the Times of Scotland, broadcasts for BBC Radio, and is currently working on her next book. She's from London but lives in Edinburgh. Amy Williams, who will be questioning Chitra, was recently a fellow at the Solberg Institute on Migration and Mobility in the New School in New York. For the past 2 years, she's been the module leader of the undergrad module Holocaust and Genocide at Nottingham Trent University. and has co-authored a book with Professor Bill Niven on the memory of the Kindertransport in national and transnational memories, exhibitions, memorials, and commemorations, and which has recently been published by Camden House. She's working on her next book with Bill Niven. And in 2024, she was at Yad Vashem in Israel, where she discovered the Kindertransport. And of course, we have Joe Schlesinger from CBC in Canada as both a child of the Kindertransport and a writer about it. I'm very much looking forward to hearing this discussion, and I'm honored to be here to introduce you. So it's all yours, Amy. Oh, I think it's Melissa's, right? Sorry.
Of course, I'm also very eager to hear Chitra and Amy's discussion, so I'm going to make my introduction very short. Um, so my name is Melissa, and I'm the Communications and Advocacy Coordinator at Welcome Collective. So Welcome Collective is a nonprofit organization in Montreal, and we're very honored to be invited to by the Holocaust Museum to speak today, just to give a little bit of local and contemporary perspective to the larger topic that we're discussing today on World Refugee Day, which is people are forced to leave their homes to seek safety. And that's something that happened during the Holocaust, and it's something that's happening today. So Welcome Collective, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our organization, who we help, what we do, and then if you want to get involved, I'll provide some invitations for how you might do that. Welcome Collective began in 2017 when we saw a significant increase in people coming to seek asylum in Canada, notably from Haiti, due to political policy in the United States changing. And so a group of volunteers saw that there were families staying at shelters with nothing and moving into their first apartments with nothing, sleeping on the floor, families with kids. So they got together and they said, hey, we can do something about this. They had a goal to provide 60 families with household goods, furniture, mattresses, things like that in a month. They went well beyond that goal, helping hundreds of families. And 6 months later, they formed a nonprofit. And 7 years later, we're still here. And in the past 7 years, we've supported 27,000 people who are making new starts in Montreal while they seek protection as refugees. Um, who do we help? So we mainly help families with children, people with disabilities, pregnant women, single parents, people who face additional barriers to receiving the support they need as they start out anew in Canada. We support people who are refugee claimants. So they've come to Canada to request protection. These are people who are fleeing persecution, human rights abuses, war, genocide, gender-based violence. Just last year, we supported over 8,000 people from 82 different countries around the world. That includes places that you've heard talked about a lot in the news, like Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gaza, but also places that receive less media attention, Haiti, Nigeria, Colombia, Guinea, Angola, Bangladesh. These are places that also have very serious human rights conflicts, and we're welcoming families from all over the world. I just want to say a little bit about the connection with the topic today of the Kindertransport. So the journey to seek safety is something that I feel connects the topic of the Kindertransport with the families we're welcoming in Montreal today. And I just want to tell you a story of a mother that I met from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. She witnessed a sexual assault and tried to report it to the police. Um, and by doing that, she became a target of police violence um, due to political uh, problems in her country, and received ongoing threats from the police to the point that she had to flee. She secured a ride on a boat, a ship across the Atlantic Ocean. Um, to South America. And then over the period of about 3 months, she took boats, trains, and buses and cars and walked from South America through Central America, through the jungle to Mexico, to the US border, got across the US border, made her way through the United States to the Canadian border, where she was able to request asylum by crossing at Roxham Road. The entire time that she was doing this, she was pregnant with twins. And she gave birth to her twins a couple months after she arrived in Canada. Um, Today, she has refugee status. She's an accepted refugee. Her twins are flourishing. They must be about 7 years old now. I met her back when Welcome Collective first began. Um, and this is the profile of the people we help, people who are putting everything on the line because they can't stay in their home countries. Um, and I find that it's a really resonant reality when we think about people who were saved on the Kindertransport as well. Um, and I think it's really important that we're here today to talk about this, not only to remember the past, but also to understand more about our present and what's happening in our communities right now. Um, Very quickly, I'm just going to let you know that you can get involved. Welcome Collective accepts donations of furniture, household goods, um, baby items. You can go to our website, welcomecollective.org, and make a donation offer. Our team will respond to you really quickly. We also offer an at-home um, pickup service. We also accept financial donations. We're not government funded. Less than 1% of our budget last year came from public sources. So every donation really helps our work. And my last invitation to you is to be aware that the federal government in Canada has recently presented a bill. It's called Bill C2, which severely restricts access to asylum in Canada. It's modeled on US policy. And I would really encourage you to read about it and contact your MP. And this is maybe one of the most impactful things you can do right now for refugee rights in Canada. Um, in the post-event email, you're going to receive more information about that and how to do it. And I'm gonna stop myself here. Thank you so much for your time and for listening to me. And I'm gonna pass it to Amy and Chitra.
Thank you so much for all those introductions. I do apologize. I do have a partial flu, so if I sound weird, I do apologize. What a pleasure it is to be here. I had the privilege of researching at the centre a few years ago during my PhD, and now to introduce and to have this conversation with you, Chitra, is phenomenal because your book, as we've seen, has touched so many people already in the audience. I'm going to be asking questions that are um, for those people that have read the book, there'll be some quite in-depth questions that really touch upon what is in the book. But for those people that haven't had the privilege of reading it yet, but they will, we've got some more open questions. So to begin with, as we've heard, it's Refugee Week. It's we are talking on World Refugee Day. What did you actually know about the Kindertransport before you embarked upon your own journey and before you knew Henry?
Thank you. Thank you, Amy, for that question. And I just want to very briefly say thank you in particular to Rachel for that beautiful, beautiful introduction. It means so much to me to hear these responses, particularly from Holocaust survivors and Kindertransportees as well. Um, so to get that kind of response, makes all of the years of writing and head-wringing, worthwhile. So thank you. Do you know, I think that I had learned a little bit about the Kindertransport at school as an extremely you know, an example of this great humanitarian rescue effort on the part of the British government. And particularly, it was interesting the way that it was sort of harnessed as this very safe way in Britain of the more kind of conservative and right-wing aspects of British politics, ways of almost patting themselves on the back while, as Melissa so rightly pointed out, they were failing so abjectly to support refugees in the present. So I found that paradox very telling, shall we say, as I started to work on this book. And I think one of the first things that I started to uncover as I did the research, and as I spent time with Henry, I mean, I met him just over a decade ago, and really for that entire decade up until his death last year was, I interviewed him time and time again, and many of our interviews were about the Kindertransport. And what I started to understand was that in actual fact, beyond the British government's willingness to let this thing happen. It really was down to the will of the people that it happened at all. In other words, the British people had to pay the money. These sponsors had to put up, a fair amount of cash to take these refugee children, these unaccompanied child refugees in. Many, many organizations came together, both non-denominational and religious organizations. So, what I started to understand was that this was a kind of grassroots organizing as we understand it now. Um, this isn't to diminish the effort of the British government, but it's just to understand how something as, you know, absolutely fundamental. This saved the lives of, you know, 10,000 children. That this happened for very, very complex reasons that were to do with very, very many different, diverse people who maybe would have disagreed on so many grounds, but on this one principle, they agreed that they must get the children out and that they would do this thing. So I found that fascinating to discover.
Oh, I love how you sum that up. It's fascinating. I want to talk to you then about what you said about like going into the journey and experiencing that and understanding what the Kindertransport means and what it meant to Henry and what it now means to you. And I want to sort of think about your the narrative and how you frame the narrative in your book because you really challenge what we know as to be as the Kindertransport. And the opening of your book, not the first chapter, but the following chapters are you pick up on a part of the Kindertransport, or rather the narrative after the Kindertransport, after arrival, which many people might be shocked about. And this is what in terms of internment and the narrative internment, which some people might not understand or realize there is a Kindertransport connection there. And I wonder why you started there with, with this is a Kindertransport story in essence, and why there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. This is, you asked me when I first found out about the Kindertransport, and I said, it would have really been at school when I learned about the Holocaust. Wouldn't it have been so interesting if, as part of that education, I had then found out that some of those same children that this country saved, the government then interned some of them. I mean, it's so confusing. And it so kind of problematizes and deepens the history that in other words, I'm actually not that surprised I didn't learn it. But this is a facet of British history that we would do well to understand more of, and just to simply state the facts, because the fact is that Henry Wooger arrived in this country as a teenage boy It was May of 1939. The following year, he turned 16. He was still a minor. And he then got arrested for corresponding with the enemy. Basically, he was writing letters to his family. He was called up to the High Court in Edinburgh. He was then taken back to Glasgow to the house of his sponsor, who she herself was a refugee, Mrs. Etta Hurwitch. I always say her name because these people should be documented in history because they literally saved people's lives and no one tends to remember them. And he was taken and then he was interned in a series of 6 camps across the country, some of them at which I should add, the conditions were said to be worse than the concentration camps in Germany. I mean, this was absolutely staggering to me to discover. And I just felt that the sort of British wartime history was so superficial, really, in what we were willing to preserve, the history that we were willing to preserve, and the history that we were carefully concealing, that it was all part of the same story. It did not take away from the fact, by the way, that Henry, his entire life, and Ingrid, his wife, who was also a Kindertransportee and Holocaust survivor, that they both felt enormously grateful to this country. Of course they did. So these are not ways of, you know, cancelling out the great humanitarian effort. They are simply about telling the truth in the round.
Yeah, and seeing that sort of complex history, that transnational history of the Kindertransport. I know Henry was interned in, I think it was Rathmills, Isle of Man. I mean, he could have potentially have been sent as an internee to Canada. You know, Kinder was sent to Canada and Australia as well. So you've talked about the importance then of understanding the complexities and the truth around the Kindertransport. And we're really privileged to see in your book the archival documents. You know, as we've talked in the past that Henry was meticulous with keeping records, and you were, you know, you witnessed those records, you saw them, and you talk a lot about the National Archives. What was it like for you first to see these documents, and then what did you learn from them?
Which documents do you mean in particular?
A variety. Well, there's so many in the book. Whichever ones that really strike you, either his internment ones or other ones.
Because it was, the reason I ask is because there was this 49-page file that in many ways propelled the start of the writing of the book. And to return to your earlier question just momentarily about why choose to begin with this moment, I mean, part of it is my background is as a journalist, and this moment where the 16-year-old boy is pulled up to the High Court, it read like a thriller. And I thought it would be a very powerful place to begin with the unaccompanied child refugee not being saved and crossing over from Germany to, through the Hook of Holland and then winding up at Harwich. Um, in England, but instead to begin with this, because for a start, it's the history that's not told. It's also probably the most dramatic event. It was probably more traumatizing in many ways than the actual traveling on the Kindertransport. And as I say, there was that sense of kind of the history that had been, obscured, neglected, misrepresented. So I did choose to begin there. As for the 49-page document from the National Archives, what amazed me about that was how live this history was and remains, because Henry only got access to these documents in his 80s and 90s. In other words, for the vast majority of his entire life, which he built a very beautiful and good life in Glasgow, there were certain things that he knew only at the level of memory, and not only just memory, but memory that is kind of founded on trauma. So there were certain hunches that he had, one of which was that he felt that maybe he had been investigated by MI6, and he felt that he had perhaps come close to not getting naturalized. These were always kind of suspicions and hunches, but he never had the proof. And so archives can provide a huge amount of proof to the person that that archive is about. That's what makes them so incredibly emotive. So when I read that 49-page document that he finally got from the National Archives, and that was through the help of an MP in Scotland, his local MP, and they did a Freedom of Information request, and quite a lot of the file actually he couldn't access, so only some of it is available to the public, even though it's about him. Um, it was just extraordinary to read all these reports by local police officers, by teachers who had taught him, headmasters, who were basically analyzing whether this teenage boy was perhaps a communist. Why did they think he was a communist? Because he was attending a refugee centre in Glasgow, which essentially was the only place really where these German and Austrian and Czech refugees could get together, have a cup of coffee, talk about what was going on in their home countries, possibly even speak German, um, sing songs, talk about politics. It was a safe haven. It was also the reason why Henry was doubted, and it nearly, very, very nearly impacted his citizenship as well. Sorry, this is a very, very long answer.
No, this is the detail we crave. And as you said, at the start of the talk, you've interviewed Henry so many times. You've had these in-depth conversations that you're sharing with us now. What I'm most struck with this your book in particular is that the stories, how can I put it, zigzag. You weave across time and space, and I'm wondering because I've had the pleasure of, as you have, interviewing people, and the Kinder's memories, like all memories, move around in time and space. That they think associatively, and I'm wondering, was that your storytelling throughout the book, was that sort of inspired by the conversations that you had because they had moved around? Or I just want to know more about your narrative structure.
Yes, I made the decision very early on, actually, that this was not going to be a chronological story. And there were so many reasons for this. One of which was, as you say, the way in which memory functions, that, some of our memories are very, very long and complete and detailed. Some of them are very short and partial. And also, remember, I was interviewing Henry from really his 80s, his mid 80s to his late 90s. Um, and his own storytelling changed within that period as well. So, say, there might have been a 6-year break between one interview, and then I would interview him again about the same experience and get a slightly different story. So, from the point of view of veracity and sort of continuity, I had a real problem. How am I going to, it's not for me to choose which is the most accurate, nor can I really check it with anyone, which I think is something that's quite key to interviewing survivors who are perhaps in the twilight years of their lives. And it's why the responsibility to bear witness to those stories is all the more urgent, actually. So I decided to make the very elastic nature of memory part of the story itself. So, in other words, some of the chapters of Homelands are very, very long and very detailed. Some of them are much, much shorter and more impressionistic or sketch-like. Um, and also, um, there are moments in the book where I actually foreground Henry's own doubt about his storytelling, because I actually found that incredibly poignant. I can give you an example. There was a moment where he was telling me about a specific period of time when he had been evacuated from Glasgow, as all other children were when war broke out. He was evacuated to Perthshire, And then at a certain point, he was told by a police officer that he had to leave Perthshire and go back to Glasgow. So this was kind of the story of his life. He then had imagined that he was in Glasgow for a 6 week period, and he was full of stories about what happened in that time. His memory was astonishing. And then I produced a letter. I found a letter that showed that none of this made sense in terms of the dates. And not that it didn't happen, but it didn't happen in the order that he felt. And he was absolutely crushed by this. And what he said to me was, we continued to do the interview and he was talking quite animatedly, but then he suddenly paused and he looked really sad and sort of distraught. And he said, "I'm so, so sorry, Chitra, if this ruins the start of your book." And I just found that in itself so moving and such a kind of important message and theme of the book, the sort of the burden of memory, the difficulties of trauma, and the sort of reconciling of past selves with present ones, that I felt that it should just go in exactly as it happened. Um, so that meant a huge amount to me. And I also wanted the book because it's got, pe periods and memories from my own life as well. And I almost wanted it to feel like a jumble of like two family photograph books. So that you just would turn the pages and find another memory, another photo, and that over time that there would be a kind of cumulative impact and that an entire life would start to emerge. I wanted to take the entirety of Henry's life really seriously because I think refugees, and Henry always identified as a refugee, by the way, which I think is really, really important because many refugees and the Holocaust survivors of his generation, he told me this himself, they never said that they were refugees, because we live in a world that is so negative about refugees. So it's understandable. But yeah, Henry was very, very proud to be one. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going off track. So ask your next question.
No, 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 this is incredible. I'm learning a lot. Before I follow up with questions about why you included so much about the post-war period, because this is something that we don't always get in the history books on the Kindertransport. We have, pre-life, Kindertransport, bit about arrival, and then it stops maybe at the end of the war. We maybe have a chapter or a short paragraph on the post-war period. But your book is really extensive and really goes through his whole life. But I'll pause there for a moment because I want to come back to that in a moment. And I also want to talk about how you interweave your own personal story. But you touched on how there's photos in the book, which are wonderful. And I'm really struck because these photos and the layout remind me of the novel Austerlitz, which you refer to many times throughout your own book. For those that haven't read Austerlitz, it's an incredible novel. It is a Kindertransport novel, but it's more than that as well, as your book is more than a Kindertransport story. And I'm wondering why the inclusion of Austerlitz, what drew you to it, what you learnt from it, how you envision Henry's story and connection to it, and even your own. And just for those who are on Zoom, you can see how the images are presented are very blurred, even and there's movement to them as well. So yeah, if you could comment on that.
Absolutely. Austerlitz became a kind of touchstone for this book. And I think it was because, well, for a start, it is the great Kindertransportee novel. There haven't been as many as you might expect in a way. I kind of expected, when I started to do my research, I thought, I'll go and read all the Kindertransport novels. And then I was like, hold on, there is actually not that many. Of course, there's a huge literature, but as kind of fictional treatment, there isn't quite as much as I expected. And what's so incredible about Austerlitz is that it has so many layers of witnessing. So you've got obviously Sebald, the author, then you've got the unnamed narrator, who is also Sebald to a certain extent, in a kind of auto-fictional sense. Then you've got the Kindertransportee, and then you've got the story on which that Kindertransportee's story is based, and that's the story of a real life person whose identity is kind of completely buried in the book to the extent that you just wouldn't know about it unless you did the research. So that idea of both kind of histories that are spoken and histories that are silenced, but also when you're talking about atrocities that are so enormous and that are maybe also not your own. Um, this was a huge ethical problem for me, how to kind of walk into this arena as a non-Jewish person, somebody who, didn't speak Hebrew, no Yiddish, nothing, like no, I felt I had no connection to this story other than the fact that Henry and I were very dear friends, and he said to me, please write this book. Those were good reasons, but were they enough morally? So I felt that the only way to go around that really was to foreground our friendship and for the book really to be about connectedness across divides, and to not go at these stories from the perspective of, say, if I'd been Henry's granddaughter, I probably would have, gone to Nuremberg. I would have spent a long time in Berlin in the archives. I might have even retraced the Kindertransport journey myself. I would have done certain things to get into the bones of this man. But I chose to go down the Austerlitz route, which was to remain always within my own gaze, and telling his story as a kind of act of imaginative empathy, really. Because I was so worried that I wouldn't be able to pull it off. It felt like such a kind of moral high wire act. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to do it. But in the end, I think that fear was what almost kept me on the right track. And Austerlitz massively helped me with that because there were moments when, instead of, say, telling the story of Henry's grandmother and what happened to her in great detail, I told a story of what happened in a moment in Austerlitz. So it was almost like using layers of fiction and non-fiction to get a truth that's maybe so difficult that it's inarticulable.
Mm, definitely. And on this truth-seeking mission, you really show that the Kindertransport is one story in a life. And you show that how the Kindertransport impacts other moments in somebody's life. And that's what I love about the book. It really has that longevity, it has that longitudinal approach that way we really get a sense of who Henry is and his wife and his children. And I wonder if you could talk about a little bit about the relationship that you have with the family and why you really wanted to put so much of the post-war period into this book.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. It's such a good question. And of course, we've both sort of touched on this already. And I think it's exactly as you say, this sense of it's the rhetoric with which we talk about refugees now as well, that they are completely defined by the journey. Everyone wants the story of the journey. Once they're here and once they've got status, we kind of don't want to know about them anymore. Or if we do, actually, we want to speak about it as a problem. So I felt like the best thing that I could do was to spend as much time as possible, both in actually in within my own life. This took years to write, but also within the space of the covers of the book that the story should be about Henry's life in the round because every refugee deserves that. And also, I again was surprised that there really wasn't much literature out there at all as to what happened to the Kindertransport children in the UK. And maybe there's more in other countries. I'd love to hear about that. But certainly in the UK, there was not much research done. And so it mattered hugely to me to tell the stories of Henry's life after the war, um, both the sense of, forging a life, marrying Ingrid, having children, the impact through the generations in terms of the Holocaust, but also the tiny but completely sort of undocumented daily negotiations of what it is to be an immigrant, actually, which was so familiar to me from my own life as the daughter of Indian immigrants. All those ways in which, your community accepts you, your community rejects you. With Henry, it was very much related to starting up this kosher catering company, and how he both, tried to kind of he had very progressive views, but at the same time, he was catering for the Orthodox community. So the ways in which he went about negotiating that, I thought were fascinating, and I'd never really read about that before. So I really wanted to write about that, and I wanted to write also in depth about his mother, because she was this absolutely astonishing woman who managed to survive in Nuremberg as a Jewish woman for almost the entirety of the war. In the last couple of months, she was assisted by a neighbor, a postman, and his child, who together they helped him go into hiding, helped her go into hiding rather, for a couple of months, and she pretended to be a non-Jewish refugee from the East. And this is how she managed to survive. And then after the war, she did everything within her power to get to Glasgow to be with her only child. And she did get there. And I thought, well, we so crave these stories of closure, of reunion, of reconciliation. But the truth of the matter, and again, it's about being sort of very clear-eyed about the history and about the impact of something like the Holocaust, is that she just couldn't settle in Glasgow. She just couldn't make it work. Too much had happened to her, and she felt too little understood. And it was only really when she left again for America that mother and son managed to have a relationship. And so again, I wanted to tell that story because it seemed so important. That was a relationship that was absolutely watertight in terms of love and respect, but it was also very, very difficult. And she wrote amazing letters, in the ruins of Nuremberg, that I just wanted to quote from constantly because she was a beautiful, beautiful writer and an incredible woman.
Definitely, definitely. No, that comes across beautifully in the book. I really want to talk. We haven't got too much longer, and there's something that I desperately want to show you at the end. But I really want to know about the connection that you have with Henry, and I'm sure the audience do as well. I want to know the advice that he gave you. I want to know the discussions that you had over food. It's Shabbat today. I want to know what those conversations were. I want to know, what you feel are the connections and the things that connect you both. You're not from the same peer group. And I want to know how, the age gap between you, everything else. I want to know what brought you together, what still holds you together. And yeah, you talk about this sense of belonging in the book, and I think a friendship is that, and you beautifully talk about this. And yeah, we want to know more.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I think both Henry and I don't know who enjoyed it more, the feeling of kind of walking down the street together. And I just felt that everyone would be thinking, what on earth is going on there, you know? What could these two possibly have to talk about? Why are they together? Um, the fact of the matter is, from the moment that we met, I went over to his house to interview him as a journalist. That's how we first met. To his flat, him and Ingrid together, actually. And then he phoned me up shortly afterwards and invited me back for lunch. So from the very start, food was at the absolute center of our friendship. And I went there for lunch many times, and we went out. We would meet out for lunch in Edinburgh during the festival a lot as well. Um, and so I think what really united us above all, which is what unites all good friends, was a kind of shared perspective. We looked at the world in the same way. And I began to understand as I wrote Homelands, which almost felt like there was an aspect of the detective novel to writing this book, because I was trying to investigate two questions really. One of them was, why are Henry and I friends? And the second one was, why is Henry so happy and still in love with this world? I found that really hard to understand as well. With all he had experienced and with what he knew, how he had managed to build such a good life. Um, I came to sort of, answer both of those questions in kind of subtle ways. But in answer to the one about, why we were friends, I think it was this kind of commonality of perspective. And I think that in itself was very much the result of our upbringings and our kind of social and political contexts, which, when I looked at my own kind of middle class Indian background, it was so similar to Henry's middle class German Jewish Nuremberg background at that particular time in Germany, just like it was, that particular time in India, that my parents were having that sort of upbringing. Um, in other words, we are 100% the products of our contexts. And context can align in all sorts of strange and unexpected ways. And that's how friendships are born. And I think they're born like that all the time. And I love to read about them. And I wish we could read about them more because I think we're living in such a horrifically polarized world now. And there is so much spoken of hatred. This book felt to me as such an important attempt at a counterweight to all of that, that it's actually a book about they're not divides after all. Henry and I, we may be so, so different in so many ways, but actually the outcome of this book was that we are more alike than we are different because we shared the same values and principles and you know, I just I came to understand us as being much more similar than different. Like the common ground, in other words, the common ground mattered to me a lot more.
Yeah. I was desperately looking at questions that I hadn't asked you then. I'm going to end with one last thing, well, two things really, because I'll take the liberty of being the questionnaire. So just before we came on this call, you said everything I write will have a touch of Henry. You've talked about, your new book that's coming out that could potentially feature him in. He's with you. You've become part of the family, and he's become part of your family. And you end the book in the most interesting way. We've discussed this beautiful friendship, the interconnections with your own personal story, and then you end with essentially the beginning of the story, his Kindertransport journey. You end with this quote that says, "The train journey will forever be in my mind." And I feel like crying now because that part of the book is really emotive. Not like the rest isn't, but that part particularly is, especially for a Kindertransport historian. Um, and recently we talked about Henry's Kindertransport list. And I'm just going to share my screen with everybody because very, very recently I found Henry's Kindertransport list at Yad Vashem. Um, so I'll just get it up a moment. So if everybody can see here, Henry is mentioned here. And you've talked about his journey, you've talked about the journey of friendship and the theme of this week, this refugee week, is the power of community. And the power of community, the friendships that Henry made with people like yourself, but also the power of community that helped establish the Kindertransport and rescued people. This is his Dutch transfer list, and I don't think this is a document that Henry ever saw. And I think you only saw for the first time when I showed you a few days ago. And I wondered if we could end with your comments on this.
When you showed me this, Amy, a few days ago, I found it utterly overwhelming. I still do. Just to see his name, the number, 129, Heinswuger, then his address, 15 Furterstrasse, which I've still never stood on that doorstep myself. I wrote this book as well during the pandemic. when my children were very young. But I have visited that address in my consciousness so many times and written about every room in that flat at 15 Furterstrasse. And then to see, his birth date and Nuremberg, I find it completely and utterly overwhelming. And I, I know Henry's daughters, to whom, you asked me about my relationship with the family. Well, this book really was a collective effort. Both of his daughters helped me. I had family members, friends of family members working as translators for me. Gillian and Hilary, his two daughters, are still good friends of mine now. Yeah, they're my family, really. And so the thought that I know that they've obviously seen this, but that their mum and dad, that Henry and Ingrid didn't get to see this, I find actually really, really upsetting, if I'm going to be honest. Um, it's wonderful that it exists, but I do wish it could have just existed a few years ago because he would have loved to have seen this. It would have meant the world to him. And we had so many animated conversations about May the 3rd, which was the date that he walked out of 15 Furterstrasse with his mother and father. And they went to the platform at Nuremberg station, and that was where his mum and dad waved him off. And he didn't see his mother for 7 years after that, and he never saw his father again. And I I know Henry had a love of archives and documents. He was meticulous in what he kept. So the thought that this has been, languishing somewhere, and has shared the planet with Henry, for so many decades, and he didn't get to see it, it makes me very sad. And I'm so happy that it is available now. Yeah.
Exactly. And we can see this is a document that shows who the accompanying adults were on his transport. This is obviously his Kindertransport list. We actually have this letter that was sent to the Dutch border guards that tells us where and when his train would pass on the border, at what time, at the location, how many children will be on his transport. And this just gives you an example of the first page. There were some over 160 children on his Kindertransport. So again, thinking about the power of community, Refugee Week, this is one story of 10,000 children that came to Britain. And yours is one friendship within that. And I think, if everybody could write a book like you, talking about the one friendship that they may have with a Holocaust survivor or a refugee, um, the world would be a richer place for it. I wondered, just to end our conversation today, what would Henry make of this? What would he make? Your book came out a while ago, and you have continued to connect with the family, to learn about his story, he's there with you still. What would he make about, this continuing legacy of memory? How would he react to today's event?
He would absolutely love it, and he would certainly have been here alongside me. We did a lot of events together, and they were, some of the most joyous events I'll ever do. And I think he was a man who absolutely believed in the power of testimony, and archive is obviously the most tangible part of witnessing that, these are papers that we can hold in our hands, and that's how they make the transfer to our hearts. And that sense of the aliveness of history, I think, is so paramount in the discovery of these lists now, because we can have as many anniversaries as to mark the passing of time, and that's so important. But this is absolutely not done yet. New information still emerging, and new ways of understanding. And I sat down and had many interviews with Henry about those 2 days in May of 1939, that were absolutely seared in his consciousness. And he had lived them and he had spoken about them because he took the responsibility of being a survivor very, very seriously, and he worked extremely hard as a Holocaust educator in the latter decades of his life. So did Ingrid. So to see something like this, I can see him now, in my mind's eye. He would be preparing to blow up the lists and laminate them and take them to schools to show them to children. And, he would be very honored to do that. And I find that extraordinarily courageous and admirable. And of course, it makes me miss him desperately. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering all my questions. We're going to turn it over to the floor now, and see who has questions for you.
Thank
Um,
you, Amy. Thank you so much for your questions. They were absolutely wonderful.
there are many
And
more.
and you're so right that this, just seeing that one list, you get a sense of all of the different stories. And Rachel as well, seeing so much of her story in Henry's. It is just so important that we record these stories now. I just think that the time has never been more urgent, and that is also what motivated me hugely to write this book, actually. There was no waiting, there was no sitting around procrastinating whether I had the moral right to do this or, how much the story was mine. The fact was, we're living in a world where we need to do this more than ever. Um, and so it's, a total privilege to do it. And I I I made such a sort of massive kind of ethical decision really to leave the Kindertransport story to the final chapter. It felt so important that you almost reading the book would have known everything that happened by the time you got to the actual journey. I thought that there was something so right about that, both at the level of the sort of aesthetics of the book, but also at the level of the journey being this absolutely defining moment in any refugee's life, and about it being the kind of springboard to a new life. So I loved the kind of circularity of it, that you could almost finish the book and then you were back at the start again.
No, I loved how you summed everything up. It's so special to speak with you. I'm going to see if there's anybody who wants to ask a question. Are there any questions in the chat that we have? I can see a lot of praise, but we need some questions.
Oh no, let's just read out the praise.
Yeah, I was going to say. Well, has the praise is phenomenal. It that they've said how um what an enlightening talk, but I wonder if anybody's got any questions to ask. I have lots more, but I'll open it up. Is this a question? Uh, I think that there is a question, but it was to one of our other speakers at the start.
Mhm.
So I will come back to that in a moment. Somebody wrote, what happened to Henry's father?
Yes, Henry's father was a really wonderful man. He was Austrian and he was not Jewish. And I think in some ways this was actually why Henry's mother survived for so long during the war in Nuremberg, because she was kind of under his protection. But obviously the toil that the war took was so dreadful. He was a perfectly healthy man in his prime, but he had a heart attack and died during the war. And that's how Henry's mother, her name was Laura, she ended up on her own. And then, to sort of give an example of what I was talking about earlier, and what Amy and I were saying about how little the aftermath of the war, and the refugees and Kindertransportees' lives in their country that they wound up in, it's so little spoken of, is Henry then, while he was in Glasgow, hoping that his mother would come, and that they would be able to get her papers organized so that she could join him, um, he was kind of getting a little bit more involved with the Jewish community in Glasgow. And they basically sort of were not very happy at the thought that he had a non-Jewish father. So Henry had written to his mother and said, listen, if and when you do come here, you shouldn't tell anyone. Now, for Laura Wooger to be told something like that, after what she had experienced, it completely devastated her. And she wrote this absolutely extraordinary letter to Henry, which I actually ended up quoting in full because it was so powerful. And if we don't have more questions, I'll maybe read it, track it down in the book and read it out because it was such a brilliant example of two people who loved each other very much, but were almost speaking at cross purposes because they were living such dramatically different existences. Henry didn't understand that what had said to her was so devastating, and she didn't understand how hard his new life in Glasgow was. And I found that sort of um, the sort of things that could not be said between parents and children, obviously in completely different and much less intense ways in my own life. But I don't think there's a first and second generation parent and child who won't identify with that to some extent.
Definitely. We do have more questions.
Great.
So we've got this. This is a really lovely question. Was Henry friends with any other people from the Kindertransport? You mentioned obviously his wife Ingrid. So yeah, could you elaborate on that?
Yes, he was. He was a man with many, many friends. I'm surprised more books haven't been written like Homelands about him, to be honest. So yes, he knew many other Kindertransportees, and he also attended reunions quite regularly. I wrote about a reunion that he would go to a lot in the Catskills, actually. Um, that he finally became the very last person who was alive to attend those reunions. So yes, that meant a huge amount to him. And although, some of them, they were very, very different people, he was a man who could accommodate a huge amount of difference, whether that was, making negotiations with the Orthodox Jewish community, trying to kind of appease his mother, meeting a woman like me. Um, it was another thing that I found incredibly inspiring about him, actually, was his capacity to accommodate so many different points of view. And even amongst the Kindertransportees, there's a huge diversity of opinion and life experience as well. He was never embittered by his internment, by the way. He completely understood. I mean, that was another example of his kind of generosity of perspective, that he just really understood it in the context of how paranoid people in Britain were and how much sort of hate was being stirred up by the right-wing press. He chose to see it in that way, whereas other Kindertransportees or Jewish refugees who were interned, it completely destroyed them.
Yeah. I think Rachel has a question.
I do. But I want to hear the letter, so I'll talk very, very fast, please, Chitra. My perspective is a little different from yours and from what you experienced with Henry, because our family was clinging together. It wasn't separated. And the survival aspect was paramount in not separating anybody, the small little unit, and not losing one or another of it. And I had a vision as you were describing, and then I'll stop talking because I think you and I have to keep talking after this. But I had visions of my mother's Sunday afternoon tea parties where she invited fellow survivors. And I think if you had joined us, Chitra, I was a young teenager then, you would have had four novels. And one grouping of three I called my mother's version of Sophie's Choice because it was three. I never could figure out as a child who was the husband, who wasn't. It was the three who survived together. but strong and capable of surviving in Canada. So I'll stop talking. Amy, I wanted to know if you found any interesting names that you didn't know existed on that Kindertransport list.
Oh gosh, yes. I found the lists of the children that went to England, lists of children that went to America, to Australia, to France, Belgium, Holland. But I've just recently found that there was a Kindertransport that left from Austria to Ethiopia. And there was also a Kindertransport from Croatia that went to Switzerland, but also into British
Really?
Mandate Palestine. Yes, and that was in 1942, 43 during the war itself. So the concept of the Kindertransporter and who is a Kindertransportee can be broadened.
Wow.
Very interesting.
It is absolutely fascinating. And again, just another clear sign, isn't it, that this is live and sort of sinuous and ongoing history. I am now just frantically trying to look for this letter, so talk amongst yourselves while I try and
Okay.
find it.
So while you look for it, does anybody have another question while we look to just to sort of sum up with the reading of Henry's mother's letter? Is there one more question before we read?
Amy, do you want me to respond to the initial question?
Please, yeah. So
Yeah,
before
I,
you read
I
the letter, it was where in South America did the Congolese woman go through on her way to Canada through Brazil or Colombia?
yeah, so she did go through Brazil and then Colombia, and then on to Panama and through Central America. And then the second part of that question was, why did she choose Canada over the States, which has more job opportunities? Was it Trump's policies? And I thought that was actually a really good and interesting question. And I appreciated Rachel's introduction, where she referred to the refusal of countries to accept Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, which reminds us that refugees fleeing danger are searching for safety. So Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, I don't think were shopping for the best job opportunities, right? They didn't have that privilege. And it's the same today. So this particular woman, her claim fell under gender-based violence, and the United States doesn't recognize gender-based violence as a reason for refugee status, whereas Canada's refugee determination system does recognize gender-based violence. And that's in her particular case, that's why she had a much better chance of having refugee status in Canada, whereas in the United States, her chance of having that status would be almost zero.
Wow, gosh. I think we should read about Henry's mother's letter to sort of sum up in the sense of we're talking about Refugee Week. This is a woman that didn't escape, who writes to her son who did escape, and the families that were torn apart and are still torn apart because of refugee status and people who can flee and can't flee. I think this is a really moving and quite powerful way to conclude the talk. And in thinking of homelands, she was writing from her homeland, Henry's former homeland, to his new homeland. So, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and thank you all so much for inviting me to speak at this event on World Refugee Day. It's felt like such an important and very beautiful way to mark it. Thank you, thank you. So, this I include towards the end of the book, and as I explained, this was a really very complicated very nuanced part of their relationship. And she was not a woman who minced her words, shall we say. She told him exactly what she thought about this very innocent suggestion that, oh, Mum, if and when you come to Glasgow, I've been told not to mention that Dad wasn't Jewish, as if this were something shameful that had to be hidden in order for Henry and his mother to be sort of welcomed into the community. You say I should speak to no one about father. My dear Heinz, do you realize how much that hurt? If your dead father, who suffered so endlessly for us, knew that was how you saw things. We, who suffered so unspeakably because of senseless racial hatred, have every reason to look beyond all prejudice. The inner value of man does not depend on the cradle in which he is born. Do the right thing and fear no one. That was the principle in the house of your parents. For my whole life, we have never lived by judging others, and I stand far above such opinions. It is simply wrong to go through life in secrecy just because of others. And those who care can stay away because I can do without such people. If out there people are concerned with such things, they have not grasped our tragedy. I hope that with me you will honor Father. He loved you through everything, and for me, the wound of his loss can and will never heal. Do not let the reunion we have so longed for be tarnished. We want to be free, open people. Help me to find a way to forget all the pain and humiliation I have been through. I can't read it without crying. I find it so intensely moving. And she was writing this, so immediately. This was not history, this was what she was going through. And to articulate that sentiment, which is she's so proud in spite of everything that's been sort of put upon her. She has such self-respect and sort of composure. I find it unbearably moving.
I agree. You ought to send it to some of our government officials or the Americans if they can read.
Yeah, I have to
It's
say that that's so relevant today.
yeah,
This we hear this all the time, this question of who gets to be a refugee, who deserves protection.
Why otherness?
Mm.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. It's such a statement in absolute support of humanity, even after witnessing the most inhumane atrocities imaginable. And I find that just breathtaking, really.
I completely agree. And I think I hope more people read those words, because they're exactly what we need today. So, Chitra and Amy, on behalf of myself and everyone at the museum, I want to thank you for this moving conversation. It was so insightful, and it's going to stay with me for a long time. I also want to thank our partners at Welcome Collective. And I want to mention one of our events that we're also hosting this month. As part of Pride Month, we're hosting a virtual screening of the documentary Dear Freddie until June 23rd. The documentary looks at the story of Freddie Hirsch, an openly gay German-born Jew who was appointed head of the youth department, caring for 4,000 young people in Theresienstadt. You can register for free through our website, and I highly recommend that everyone watch this very beautiful, moving documentary. And I want to thank everyone who attended today's event. So Shabbat Shalom and have a great weekend.
Kat, can you call me?
Yes, of course.
Chitra, Amy, thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Larissa,
you,
I look forward to
Rachel.
meeting you again.
Thank you.
I hope we get to meet Rachel.
I do.
Thank you so much for your introduction, and Amy, thank you for your beautiful questions.
Thank you for the work that everybody does here, from the museum to the journalists and authors that, as a, but go buy the book and then you'll be able to read everything in here and you'll be able to read that powerful, powerful letter again. I really do recommend, please go get the book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you so much.